Mary and Joseph had a little bit of a Home Alone kind of moment in today's gospel. They forgot their son, it seems. Well, at least they thought he was with them, but it turns out he was not. Now, in Home Alone, at least they were trying to get 11 kids to the airport in a rush. So maybe it's easy to forget one. But for Mary and Joseph, they just had the one to care for. Now, when we encounter this part of the journey of the Holy Family, it can be very easy for us, our hearts to be moved in one of two ways. That of great empathy and compassion and the distress that they must have felt of not knowing where their child was. Or ask, what kind of parents are you? Now, as Christian believers, we're hesitant to say the second about the Holy Family. But what about those journeying with them? What about when they recognized that Jesus wasn't in their midst and they began to panic? What did those around them say? Those around them may have not understood the significance of what their life or their journey was about, or the call that they had received. And they look at them and they might say, well, I guess it's fitting that you lost him. I mean, Mary, you were pregnant even before you were married. Joseph, he's not even your son. There's all sorts of things that those around the Holy Family in their own time could have said. Fingers that could have been pointed, judgments that could have been made. Because even though they are the Holy Family, from external observations, they look anything but normal. They seem to contradict every standard norm that should have existed in their time, and yet they were the family that God called forth. Now it was, of course, God's will that the peculiarities of their life evolved in the way that they did. But nonetheless, what defined them in their holiness was not the fact that they looked perfect. What defined them in their holiness was the fact that they persevered in love time and time again in the midst of trial after trial. I don't know anyone who has a perfect family. I certainly did not. There was much love in our family, but just like many other families, there are certain relatives that I haven't seen or heard from in many years. Can't even seem to remember why. But those chasms have grown. And as an only child and my parents each having very few siblings, most of the people growing up that I called aunt and uncle weren't even related to me by blood. So what makes a family a family? Is it just our blood ties? That can be part of it. Or is there something more? Is there something to a commitment of love to journey with the other? Is that what bonds us? We hear from St. John that we are indeed the children of God. Every single one of us. And therefore we're commanded to love as he loved. And so what does that mean when we examine our own lives? The dysfunctions we find within our own relationships, the challenges and trials that befall our own families. How easy is it to want to point fingers of judgment toward the family next door? If nothing else, just to give us a little comfort to say, well, at least we're not screwed up like them. We've all done that. We've all been there. Or even worse, in those moments when we turn in on ourselves and we say, all the hopes and dreams I had for my marriage or for my children or for anything else that was going to come into my life and the relationships that I had, and it just hasn't come together that way. And then what we feel is shame and doubt and judgment toward ourselves or those we've tried to love. And yet, in the midst of every stumbling block that comes our way is once again an opportunity to reach out in a profound sense of love. To say that whoever has come into my life, whoever life I have wandered into, if we are called to be family, if we are called to give of ourselves radically for the sake of each other, then this is an opportunity to find holiness. When the outside world looks in on the chaos of our lives, it may not look like it. They may not see it. They might point fingers in judgment. But if we continue to search for that presence of God in our midst and to nurture it, then we find our truest identity as God's children. And so when we look at our own families and we realize who we are, and we know that those entrusted to our care don't in fact even belong to us, as we see modeled so radically in Hannah. She prays and prays and prays and begs and begs and begs for a child, and she finally receives a son. And what does she do? She takes him to the temple and hands him back to God. Because she realizes that as much as her love for that child was her world, he belonged to someone greater than herself. And so when we begin to realize not only are we God's sons and daughters and beloved by Him, but we are bound in His family, and those entrusted to our care, whether they bring us great joy or great trial, are indeed His as well. And then we begin to see that the boundaries that exist in our families maybe aren't as tight as we thought. Maybe our family is larger than we ever imagined. Maybe my family isn't defined just by those who live under my roof, or those with whom I was raised, or those with whom I share a last name or a bloodline. Maybe my family has nothing to do with these external definitions, or our political affiliations, or the languages we speak. But my family has to do with the fact that both you and I are beloved by God. And so we become God's family, the body of Christ. And then we know that our family isn't just those to whom I call family, or those gathered in this place, but our larger community, those in our city, our state, our nation, our world. And it's in those moments that we realize the mutual commitment we have to each other to walk with one another transcends all divisions that we could create. And in so doing, we find ourselves then, maybe you have as I have, heartbroken and challenged by the moments in which we seem to fail to love one another well. We seem to fail to see the face of the Holy Family in those who walk beside us. In moments when it's easier to point a finger and declare a judgment than to open an arm or seek the needs of the other. And although we cannot transform the world on our own individually, the lives we live in our own families, our capacity to continually to seek love and reconciliation, to continue to form bonds of unity that transcend things that divide us, become the testament to the world of what it was for Christ to be present in the midst of the Holy Family, that so too is He with each and every one of us. And then that has implications far beyond ourselves. Because then we begin to see the true value of each and every human life. It's so easy to dismiss others as utilitarian. And that's something that has challenged our society for a very long time. It's very easy to define another life simply based on the value that it brings to me, and not in the care that I am called to offer it. And we see that challenge now as a nation, as we confront and attempt to grapple with the complexities of the large migration moving toward us from Central America. And we see it, if you've been watching the news, in the 3 young lives that have been lost. A child less than 2 years of age 2 months ago, a 7-year-old a month ago, and an 8-year-old on Christmas Day. Struggling to find their dignity because of the kind of welcome that they were shown. But they're faces that represent so many others who are disregarded and discarded, from those in the womb to those in our prisons, to those in our own communities and families that we just assume not see or bother with. They're all a reflection of the brokenness that exists in every one of our families, that exists on a global scale. And yet, in the midst of all of that trial, all of that uncertainty, there is the constant invitation to live a life of love and holiness. A call from God anew to say, remember who's been entrusted to your care. Remember who is yours. Remember to give them back to God.